Ryan Thomas with East West here, and welcome to the next video in our Scoring with Opus series, where we show you how to use all the instruments included in East West Composer Cloud, which includes the new Hollywood Orchestra Opus edition, to score real scenes similar to what you might find in a film, TV show, or video game production. Now, we like to cover as many diverse genres as possible, so in this video, we'll be working with a clip that could be right out of a nature documentary, complete with the over-the-top sound design that we've come to expect from this genre. So in the next few minutes, we'll be talking about some of the unique challenges and considerations that you might face when scoring a nature documentary, including how to determine musical direction, how music helps to define the narrative, and the outsized role that music tends to play in this genre. And of course, we'll be doing it all with Composer Cloud instruments. So we have a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and dive right in. And I'd like to start by just playing through this video with only the sound design, no music, so that we can talk about some of the big picture considerations when determining the musical direction for a scene like this. So I'm just going to solo the sound design, and we're going to go full screen. Okay, so obviously this isn't an animated film, it's not an action scene, so I don't think it would be appropriate for the music to be changing with each scene. This needs to more or less be a cohesive piece for this entire minute-long clip. And I think that's going to present some challenges, because at the beginning, you've got these shots of these very graceful birds, and then it cuts to shots of some bigger animals like lions and elephants, so the music does need to change, but the feel can't change between those scenes. And the way that we're going to do that is to have the underscore for the shots of the birds essentially act as an introduction to the rest of the piece. And we're going to start off with some very delicate textures that will run throughout the piece, but that you can also build on with other instrument sections that will add some textures that are more appropriate for the later scenes. So let's go ahead and see how we did that. So let's start at the beginning, and I'm going to have the sound design unmuted so that you can hear how it's integrating with the music. All right, so as you can hear, this is going to be a bit more of a texture-driven piece. And we do have some very delicate textures at the beginning, consisting of harp, some tuned percussion, both traditional, orchestral, and some world instruments. And these are going to run throughout the length of the piece, and they're going to give us that consistency that we need, but they're also going to be a great foundation for the other instrument sections as this piece evolves. And it makes sense in a piece like this to have some world instruments because, of course, this film is ostensibly about animals from all over the world. So let's go ahead and break it down. And let's start with the two instruments that are kind of going to be the driving force of this piece. And the first one here is the Tonal Hit 05, which is actually a preset from Hollywood Orchestrator consisting of the harp pluck, celesta, and the crotales. So let's just hear what this sounds like. So that's just kind of noodling around on what is the holiest of chords, the G sus. Hashtag dad jokes. And that's going to be joined by the gamelan, which is from Ra. And this is a really beautiful instrument. It's just really useful in quite a few different contexts. Let's hear what they sound like together. And I should point out that there is a good bit of each instrument signal being sent to a dotted eighth stereo delay, and that's just going to help disperse the sound, and it's going to make it seem like these instruments are kind of floating. And these two instruments are going to be that common thread that I talked about earlier that are going to kind of tie the whole piece together, give you that continuity that you need, while also allowing you to develop the piece as the scenes are changing. Now, the string parts here are very simple, and I'm just using the sustain articulations in both the 18 violin key switch as well as the viola key switch. And then at measure 6, I do have a solo cello from Hollywood Solo Cello coming in just to add some movement and a little bit of color. So let's hear how it all sounds. Okay, and moving on to the woodwinds, we just have an alto flute and an English horn. So this is the alto flute line here, and then this is going to be the English horn. So let's hear how the strings sound with the woodwinds and the tuned percussion. And that glockenspiel line at the end is just there to help that English horn solo speak through the mix a little bit better. If you have a woodwind solo that's not quite cutting through the mix well enough, consider adding glockenspiel or celesta, depending on the context. And I want to stop for a minute and talk about the alto flute. I think it's one of the most beautiful woodwinds in the woodwind section, and I'm an oboe player myself. And I think it does really well in a piece like this where you just have these big, lush chords, and you need something that's going to be more of an effect than an instrument. So what I've done is sent quite a bit of the signal to a dotted eighth stereo delay, and I want to just play around with it for a minute to show you just how beautiful this instrument is on its own. I could just play with that forever. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the last instrument that we're going to look at. And here we just have this really beautiful patch from Hollywood Strings, which is actually the entire orchestral ensemble. And it's the sul tasto articulation. So it just gives you these really delicate textures. It's really responsive to that mod wheel. So let's just hear how it helps to fill out this section. And one last thing I should point out before leaving this section is that we do have these accents here coming from the Dynasty Odaiko, which I have filtered, so you're just getting the lowest frequencies from it, and it's kind of acting like a sub-boom. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next section. And we'll start a couple beats out so you can get that Dynasty Odaiko roll. So here we're starting to introduce some light percussion, a little bit of brass, and the full woodwind section. Let's go ahead and break it down. And in the strings, we have these really closed chord voicings, a lot of chord color, some extensions here, and the violin 1 and 2 are going to be taking this melody. I actually have the 18 violins on violin 1, and then just the regular second violin patch for violin 2. So let's hear how the strings sound by themselves. And the only articulations we're using there are just some sustains and some legato. So now let's add our brass. And we just have some French horn content here. We've got the solo French horn, and then we've got the 2 French horns that are going to be joining the solo French horn halfway through measure 12. So let's hear the brass and the strings together. So that solo French horn is just going to help fill things out some, and it's also going to add some of that beautiful color that you get from the solo French horn at those lower dynamics. Now, if you noticed, the 2 French horns came in when you had that moving line in the cello, and the French horns are doubling that cello line up until this note here, when they just go one step above it to give you just that little question before the next phrase. So you can hear how well those French horns are complementing the cello there. That's a really beautiful doubling, and it's a great way to add some body to a string section. Let's go ahead and check out the woodwinds. And we just have this really lovely repeating line that is being played by the Woodwind Ensemble, which is from Hollywood Orchestrator. This is just the Staccato Basic 01 preset. And those are being joined by the solo flute and clarinet that are actually going to be playing a counter melody with the strings. And that counter melody is almost more felt than heard, but I think it's a really cool texture to add to this part. Now let's see what's happening in the percussion. And we just have 2 percussion tracks here. We've got the Lord of Toms Ensemble emphasizing these main rhythmic accents here. And then you have the percussion multi, which consists of all of these instruments I have in this one instance of Opus, kind of giving us more of a driving rhythm there. So everything together sounds like this. And we're keeping those velocities nice and light so we get that much broader frequency response from those drums. And we've changed things up a bit in the harp and the tuned percussion just to reflect those chord changes that are happening in the other instrument groups. So here is everything together. So in a scene like this, obviously, you don't have to worry about being sensitive to dialogue because there is none, but you still have to be careful not to just squash the sound design because it is important here, and otherwise it wouldn't be there. Now, we have this shot of the lion, so the music needs to build, but you still have to have some common threads from the previous phrase. And I think that's important in a series of shots like this, because you've got all these different animals, but they're occupying this ecosystem. And even though, of course, the lion does eat many of the animals in that ecosystem, they're all part of this interlocking system that creates a functional biome. So I think it's important to maintain that cohesive structure in the piece. So let's go ahead and move on to the next phrase. And here we're adding more brass, we're adding more percussion, and we are introducing some vocals. And if you notice, the bass elements became staccato in this section, and that was done very intentionally, because in the sound design, you had the hoof beats on the ground, and that creates a lot of bass content. I tried using just some sustained basses in this section, and it didn't work with the sound design. It was too muddy. So once I put those basses on those staccato notes that are actually playing the same rhythm as those percussion accents, it totally worked with the sound design. So let's go ahead and break it down by instrument group. And in the strings, we're just doing some pretty basic chord changes. There isn't any melody here. And notice that we have the basses on these staccato notes here up to measure 16. And then we put them on sustains to crescendo into the next phrase. So nothing too complicated going on there. Let's check out what's happening in the brass. And the strings are going to be joined by the French horns and the trombones. The French horns are basically going to be doubling the high strings on those chord changes, but I have added this little staccato line here just to add a little bit of extra texture and color. And the trombones are going to be doubling the string basses because we just want to add some bite and some grit to those bass stabs. So here is the strings and brass together. I think the trombones are really crucial in this moment because the string basses by themselves don't have quite enough punch to cut through the mix well enough, and you definitely need some low brass content on those bass stabs. And the new Two Trombones patch from Hollywood Orchestra Opus Edition is a great way to add some bite to your string basses in parts like this, because in the mid to higher velocities, those short articulations just have so much bite, and they're really just ear-pleasing. So let's go ahead and see what's happening in the woodwinds. And all we're doing here is doubling the strings in the Sustain Unisono preset from Hollywood Orchestrator. So this is a woodwind ensemble patch. Let's hear it by itself, and then we will hear it with the brass and the strings so that you can hear just how much color and body it's adding to the strings and brass. And then with the brass and the strings. So I think for sections like this, you don't really need to program each woodwind instrument individually, because the only element that the listener's ear is going to pick up is just that little bit of color that's speaking over the rest of the orchestra. And these Hollywood Orchestrator ensemble presets are just phenomenal when you have to write quickly, so they're really great for those tight deadlines. Now let's skip the percussion just for the moment, and we're going to check out what's going on in the vocals. So we've got this boys word builder patch, and they're just singing this phrase here. They're actually doubling the Voices of Opera Legato A patch. And then we have the women's choir just singing this phrase, and they're basically doubling the strings on these chord changes. So let's hear what everything sounds like together. So the choir is just adding some body to this section, and I really like using these word builder patches just to keep things interesting and add a little bit of subtle variation to the mix. Now we've got a lot going on in the percussion, so we're just going to start off in the orchestral percussion, and the majority of the content here is just going to be this preset in Hollywood Orchestrator. It's the Short Hit 02. This is what it sounds like by itself. So you've just got these really nice layered hits with the concert toms, the bass drum, and the snare, adding some edge to those hits. And then at measure 16, you've got the timpani coming in with this hit, and then it does a roll into measure 17, and it's being joined by this cymbal swell. Now let's add the rest of our percussion. And the Lord of Toms and this percussion multi are basically doing what they've been doing in the previous phrases, but we have added the djembe ensemble. And it's just going to be providing some higher frequency content in this percussion section to help drive things along. And we also have the tambourines from Goliath, and they're going to alternate between these hits and these shakes. And you'll hear that in just a minute. So let's hear everything together. And then finally, let's add the gamelan and our harp and tuned percussion. And they are actually just going to be doubling each other on this line. And because I wanted to build into this next section, I opted to put the harp, tuned percussion, and gamelan on just an eighth note pattern because there was already quite a bit going on in the other instrument groups, and I wanted some space to build. So again, if you notice, these are eighth notes here. And then we go back to that 16th note pattern. So again, give yourself some room to build. There are subtle ways that you can do that that are still very effective. Let's move on to the next section. And we'll start one bar out for context. And a lot of this is just similar to what was going on in the previous phrase, but we have added a good bit of brass. So let's start with our strings. And violins 1 and 2 are just going to be playing this ascending melody line with all the other string sections just blocking out these chords. But then at the end, we have these short articulations. And because I'm using the mod speed patches, the CC1 data is going to trigger a marcato note at the top of that range there. And then when it drops down to 34, that's going to trigger a staccato note. That way you get a nice da-da-da, and you'll hear that in just a moment. So nothing too complicated there. Let's see what's going on in the brass. And we've added the full brass section now. So the trumpets are going to be joining the violins on that ascending line, but they're also going to have some staccato notes interspersed. And we're filling out the rest of the brass section with full French horns and trombones. And you also have, I don't know if I want to call this a counter melody. That's probably what it is, in the 6 French horns, and you'll hear what they are doing in just a moment. So let's hear the strings and the brass together. Now, you might have noticed that the way this is currently written, you'd probably need a much larger French horn section than is typical in an orchestra to play this live. And that's fine because number one, there is such a thing as overdubs, and number two, sometimes you just have to write what sounds right. And I really wanted that 6th French horn line in there. So let's go ahead and move on. And there actually isn't any woodwind content, so let's move on to the vocals first. And we now have the full choir, and I just have the men and the women's ah combined in this same instance of Opus, and they're being joined by the boys' choir, singing pretty much the same chords, and then the Voices of Opera is going to be just following along on this top note here, adding a little bit of extra color. So you've just got this big, thick wall of sound, and we're going to introduce percussion in just a moment, and that's what's going to be the driving force for this section. And as you can see, we're starting to increase the dynamics in some of these percussion tracks, like the percussion multi and the djembe ensemble. Of course, those velocities are a bit higher than they were in the previous section, but other than that, the only instrument that we've actually added here is just some rim shots in the Chinese lion drum hits. So let's hear how this all sounds. And finally, let's add the harp, tuned percussion, and gamelan. And you'll notice now that we are back on a 16th note pattern, and they are going to be following these chord changes. So let's hear everything together. So that's it. I don't think it's too complicated either in terms of orchestration or MIDI programming, but it is important to get your textures right in a piece like this, and also to get the feel right. I think nature documentaries are challenging in their own way because you don't have human characters with dialogue that can really strongly suggest an emotion. You know, in many scenes in a typical film, there's really only one way to go emotionally. I don't think that's the case with a nature documentary. So you have a lot more freedom, but I think there's even a challenge in that. So let's go ahead and check out the reverb setup before we wrap up. And for those of you who have seen any of the previous videos in this series, this will just be review, but I am using Spaces 2 for all of my reverbs. And for strings, I'm using the Southern California Hall strings. For brass, I'm using the Southern California Hall brass. And for my woodwinds, I'm using the San Francisco Hall woodwinds. Now, I mostly use the Northwest Hall for both tuned and untuned percussion. Of course, I'm going to use the Davies Choir for my choir. And I'm using the Abandon Abbey for any instrument that just needs kind of a reverb on steroids because it's just got that 6-second long tail. And in this session, I'm using the Abandon Abbey for the Sul Tasto Ensemble patch, the Tonal Hit 05 patch, and the tambourines from Goliath because they were recorded with a close mic and I really needed them to sound very distant. Now, the delay that I'm using is, again, just a dotted eighth stereo delay. You can see all the settings here if you're interested in copying it. And yeah, that's actually pretty much it for the reverbs. And that is going to conclude this walkthrough. I want to remind you that all the instruments and reverbs that were used to create the soundtrack are available with a East West Composer Cloud subscription. I want to thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a really good time and learned some valuable information. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell because subscriptions don't mean much anymore. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.